Are you trying to use vintage patterns but are confused by the directions? Are you bewildered by the symbols? What does this even mean?
Well, don't worry. I can help with that. Welcome to Queen Deluxe. I'm Bronwen. We're going to talk about vintage patterns today, and we're going to get you all squared away so that you know what you're doing. Let's do some vintage sewing. Home sewing patterns came into existence about the same time that the home sewing machine became available to people everywhere, which was in the 1850s. But today we're going to be talking about 20th century patterns. So I have some examples from the 1920s all the way up to the 1950s. It's really from the 20s to the 1950s where things are confusing. In the 1960s, things become a little bit more easy to understand, and they're kind of based on what we see today. Finding vintage patterns. I find a lot of my vintage patterns at estate sales and at like tag sales, Goodwills, garage sales, that kind of thing. There are vintage vendors online, eBay, and on Etsy. Go to antique markets and they will have them there. I tend to shy away from the more pristine copies of patterns. I just don't trust myself with those. I'm kind of klutzy and I would hate to wreck a perfect condition pattern. So I tend to go for ones that have not been treated very nicely, and because I really want to use them for either theater purposes or for my own personal purposes. I'm gonna learn from them and use them. There's some controversy about if you should be using them and how to use them and that sort of thing. I do take care of my patterns. I hold them in bigger envelopes. They probably should be acid-free, but I can't afford that. And I try to not fold them as tiny a piece. I don't use the original envelopes anymore and stuff like that, but I still do use them. Please don't come at me in the comments for the way that I use my vintage patterns. They are not pristine copies, and I do a lot of transferring onto brown paper so that they can be, especially if they're in really terrible condition, so that they can be preserved. I would really love to get into digitally uploading them so that they can be preserved in a way where people can actually use them. In the 1920s especially, they started printing little envelopes, and they had all of their pattern pieces individually cut inside. It is one size in the envelope. I have laid out one of the pattern pieces. They are printed at this time, at least from McCall's. A lot of the other pattern companies are not they have no ink on them and they're not printed, but McCall started this where they are printed and the instructions are printed on the tissue paper as well. Some on the pattern piece, some on some individual instructions that are printed on tissue paper. It has all of your individual pieces cut out with all the information that you need on each piece. In the 1930s, we start in with the sort of norm of what vintage patterns we see. It has them cut out from tissue paper with little punched indications of all your notches, any information that you would need. And then there's a key on the instruction guide, which is on a separate piece of paper now. And it looks like it's very reminiscent of what we have today, except with some differences. All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty of patterns and what kind of information are on them and how we use them. So the first step is going to be the envelope. There's going to usually be a size printed on the envelope someplace. Every pattern company is different. They all have different sizing. It does tend to get a little more uniform in the 1950s, but don't count on it, and it's fine. Just know your measurements or the measurements that you're trying to find. It is easier to get a vintage pattern in your size or close to, and then size up a little bit instead of trying to find We're trying to have a small pattern and then grade up. We will talk about that in another video. I'm going to be doing a grading video on how to make a smaller vintage pattern fit a larger body. This is an advanced pattern. This is the pattern number. So you can do some searches on years and stuff like that. Sometimes, depending on what year the pattern was printed, what company printed it, there might be a year on it, there might not. But you can usually find out information about your pattern online by searching the pattern number. Now, some of our modern patterns have the same number, they're reusing them, so it does get you have to do a little bit of searching. On the back, it will have, one is nice, the seam allowance is indicated right here. Sometimes you have to search for that on the instructions. It tells you how many pieces are included in the pattern, what those shapes look like, and the names of each piece, because those are not printed on the individual pattern pieces. It has suggested materials. If you are going to be making up vintage patterns, this is really important to know what they made it out of. Of course, you can choose something else, and that's on you, out of your stash or whatever. I am not telling you what to do. And then we have some sizes up here, and this is just the general sizes. And then if you look down here, there is a section with the rest of the sizes. It tells you how much yardage you're gonna need for each piece and how wide that is and everything. This thing called the battle jacket, which is kind of an awesome name for it, in 35-inch material, which is pretty narrow for our modern standards. You would need 2 1/8 of a yard for a size 12. For this pattern, they have the suggested notions on the back as well. So you need a spool of thread, a 9-inch neckline type slide fastener for the slacks. In other words, you need a zipper. So you're gonna sometimes need to put on your detective hat and kind of figure things out. You will notice the size range is kind of changing depending on what period of time we're in. So the 1920s, they sometimes don't even have a waist measurement on the pattern because it's loose and not fitted. What we're fitting is the bust and the hips, but it depends on the manufacturer and all that jazz. The 1930s, the waists, and the 1940s, the waists are generally a little bit bigger because we're not wearing those girdles and those waist tightening things because that wasn't in style. So we do need to think about what kind of undergarments you're going to be wearing under the pieces that you are making. In vintage patterns, there is a certain amount of knowledge that they expect you to know already going in. Our grandmothers, our great aunts who did sew, they had more knowledge than a lot of us today have on basic sewing skills. They grew up with it. They repaired their things. Their moms taught them how to sew. So that there's already sort of like a baseline of vocabulary that is already out there. Some of the instructions that they're giving you are not full on how to make a dart. They're just gonna say, and now do your dart, because they assume you already know how to make a dart, if that makes sense. There are, depending on the year and all of that, I think it's worse with the older patterns, and it gets better with the 60s and 70s patterns. Not as many people were sewing in the 70s as there were in the 1930s. All right, let's talk about the pattern pieces themselves and the little key that's on here. On this instructions, they have a whole little thing about what all of these dots and cutouts mean on the pattern piece. So it's kind of like on a map, it's like a key of what those symbols mean. So we have 2 large or 3 large on this piece. The large holes mean the straight grain, and you would line those up. There is a little punch of letters on this pattern, which are what piece it is. So this is a sleeve. There's a little indication of a slice for placket on the arm into the cuff. There are some seam allowance marks and our regular notches, a balance mark at the top of the sleeve so that it will match up on the seam line for the shoulder. I think that's it on this particular piece. Some that are on the fold, those will have special markings, and those tend to change from pattern company to pattern company. Sometimes it's 3 dots, sometimes it's triangles. You just have to look at your pattern guide and find out what those particular punches mean on your pattern. I would say if this was the first or second time that you're using a vintage pattern, to read all the instructions first. A lot of times it won't make sense because you're not doing it while along, but I think it will sort of it'll help you settle into the instructions, and it will help along the way. I know it's not great for everybody. I am more of a picture person. I know some people do better with written instructions, some do better with pictures, and some people just need it shown to you how to do it. And you can always look up online or ask me in the comments below how to do things that if you're not understanding them. The vocabulary is sort of, again, based on knowledge that our home sewers would have already, so that it is not specifically explained. So on this instruction sheet, we have the picture of what the garment is going to look like. It has all of the little letters that correspond to our pattern pieces. So there is a little map of this is A and that is the back. It has our key diagram with what all the little dots and everything means. It tells you to do a little pin mock-up of putting it on your body. I would suggest doing this in fabric and putting that on first. Make sure that the pattern is going to work for you. And then we have a cutting diagrams on different ways that you can use your fabric. It has different widths and cutting layouts for you. And then some basic instructions on marking your pattern pieces, cutting layouts, lap, like if your fabric has nap or not, and how to lay things out, clipping, marking, and some things like this. The other side is putting your garment together. So it has the diagram of all of our pieces again, a reminder of all of the markings and how to mark stuff. And then it goes into the instructions. Sometimes your pattern that you've gotten from the thrift store won't have all the pieces inside, so you do need to check that out. Get all the pattern pieces out, see what condition they're in, see if everything is in there. If you can if it's just a facing or something, maybe you can make a facsimile of it to finish it out. I think that's about all on vintage patterns. If you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the comments and I will try to answer them best as I can. Or I'll make another video to help you guys out. Next time I will be doing a grading pattern video on how to make your patterns bigger or smaller to fit your specific size. Thanks for watching my little overview on vintage patterns and how to start working with them. It's fun and exciting. You learn so much from the past by the way things were put together and the different shapes that happen over the decades. Thanks so much for watching. If you found value in this video or learned something, please think about subscribing. If you hit that bell, YouTube will tell you when new videos come out. I'm Bronwen, and I'll see you next time. Bye!